Okay, we are still in the story of the Givonim. We spent some time going through the text, going through the story, dealing with the question of the brit with the Givonim and who made the brit with the Givonim and what kind of brit it was. And we talked last week a little bit about the difference between the attitude of Yehoshua versus the attitude of the Neviim or the representatives of the people. There seems to have been some sort of conflict there over the who speaks for the people in the context of the Givonim. Probably brought about by the Givonim themselves because they approached two different groups at the same time. Not our issue for now. And that's where we left off. What I want to explore today is two things, and we'll see if we finish the second, then great. If not, we'll continue it a little bit next week. And that is the role of the Givonim and what happens to them over the course of history, and Tanakh history in particular. So let's start. I'm going to share my screen again. And you should see my screen with the source page and the text of Yehoshua. Everybody see it? Okay,
yes.
Great. Okay. Now, here we go. So one thing I want to pick up, we didn't get to it last week, but I think it's an important observation to make, which is why when they discover the ruse that the Givonim had posed to Israel, that they were Canaanites and that they'd come from really around the corner, just north of Yerushalayim, and here they said they were actually from a faraway city, and they discover 3 days after they made a brit with the Givonim, they hear that they're very close. They're just over the hill. They travel, they go, and they come to the cities. 4 cities identified as cities of the Givonim. Givon, of course, is the biggest and the largest, and probably the capital, if you will, in those terms. And the other cities, Kfira, comes from the word Kfar, Be'erot, and Kiryat Ye'arim. They didn't kill them, they didn't fight them, they didn't say, okay, this entire breach was under false pretense, and we're going to go to war with you. They did not do so because they had taken an oath. The Neviim had taken an oath, and they took that oath B'Hashem Elokei Yisrael in the name of God. So the people turned to the Neviim and complained. We took an oath by God, in God's name. We can't touch them. And therefore they come up with the solution to let them live, but to give them a role or an assignment in the context of the Mishkan, which we talked about a little bit last week. So I want to talk a little bit for a moment about this notion that they did not counter or attack them because they had taken an oath, kinishba'u lahem, in the name of God. The Gemara addresses this question and really the notion that they had fought that this brit was under false pretense. They really had the right, if you will, to say brit under false pretense. If you lie about your identity on a contract, basic fraud on a contract, it's all null and void. There's no validity to such a brit. If you're signing a brit with one person and with somebody who tells you his identity is A and suddenly his identity is B, right? It's a classic example of false pretense. So the Gemara addresses this question, and it's Gemara in Gittin, and the Mefarshim break down, sort of set into 2 schools based on the 2 opinions that appear in the Gemara. The Gemara asks this question point blank. Rabbi Yehuda's position is that if a person makes an oath publicly, they cannot retract that oath, meaning the context of this Gemara is the whole sugya of hatarat nedarim. Can you annul oaths? So there's certain kind of oaths that you can annul. You can go to a beis din, you can say, I didn't realize that I took this oath and I didn't understand that I wouldn't be able to fulfill it. That's called a petach. And you can annul the oath. But there are certain parameters, there are certain conditions about which it says that you may not annul the oath, and one of them is neder al dat rabim, a publicly made oath, an oath that was made in such a way that everybody knows about it, not a private oath. Whereas shelo yadabur rabim yachzir, if it's a private oath, you can relent. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, you can go to Bezdin and you can have it annulled. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, my time of Rabbi Yehuda, what's the reason Rabbi Yehuda says a public oath can't be annulled? He draws a source for this from the story of the Givonim. As it says, they did not smite them, they did not attack them because they had taken such an oath. So that's the first opinion, that the reason why they didn't attack them is essentially because it was a public oath. And amongst the Mefarshim, the Radak takes this approach. We'll get to the second approach in a moment. Amongst the Mefarshim, the Radak takes this approach. And he says, this, I didn't have a translation, so I'm going to translate this on the fly. Even though the oath was taken under false pretense. So I'm going to get to the Chilul Hashem factor in a second. The fact is that there are many people who have heard the oath and won't hear that they had retracted or that there was a false pretense to the oath. And that's essentially what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. According to the Radak, the text seems to lean in favor of the opinion that says that the reason they didn't annul the oath is because it was an oath taken in public. Because the Neviim were concerned that there would be a plague or punishment for them if they violated the oath. If it was only a matter of, well, the other opinion, which I haven't read yet, he says wouldn't fit that text. So according to the Radak, the fact is that it was an oath taken in public, and the reason an oath taken in public can't be annulled is because not everybody who heard the oath, which was said in public, will hear that they retracted, or that there was a mistake, or that there was a reason why they didn't fulfill the oath. And the end result will be that you will be perceived as having violated an oath, even though you think you are legitimately doing so. That's the first opinion. The Gemara then continues and says, V'Rabbanan said, the Chachamim had a different opinion. They said, wait a second, such an oath, I understand the concept that you can't annul an oath if you take the oath in public, but that only applies to an oath that has validity. A real oath can't be annulled if it's taken in public. This oath was taken under completely false pretense. It was an outright lie. Such an oath does not apply at all. I don't need to annul it. I don't need to go to a Bezdin. I don't need anything. It's not worth the paper it's written on or the cloth it's scribed on. However, they still observed the oath because the Haidala Katlinu Mishum Kedushat Hashem, or as the Radak and the Rambam put it, Mipnei Chilul Hashem. They had every right to go to war with the Givonim. Says the Rambam, Lulei Chilul Hashem. But there's a terrible desecration of God's name. Here they took an oath in public in God's name, and they violated the oath. So the Radak explains they violated the oath in public, and because not everybody will know that the oath was under false pretense, there's also a Chilul Hashem involved. And the text really emphasizes both points, and that's what I wanted to point out. There's two reasons in the text that seem to be the emphasis as to why they did not just ignore this and go to war with them. Pasuk says, "V'lo yikum b'nei Yisrael ki nishba'u lehem nisiyei ha'edah." The elders made this oath. Nishba'u lehem b'Hashem Elokei Yisrael. It emphasizes that this oath was taken in the name of God. It wasn't just an oath, we'll sign a brit, but the oath was in the name of our God, we take this oath. And that's what the Nesim said. Anachnu nishbanu lehem b'Hashem Elokei Yisrael. Twice they say it, and here to say it again. Anachnu nishbanu lehem b'Hashem Elokei Yisrael. V'etalonu chalin go'em, we can't touch them. And that's essentially what I wanted to suggest, is that really both of these explanations, both Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, are really pointing to the same issue. The moment I take an oath in public in God's name, now I have two factors. Because an oath, typically in Tanakh terms and Chumash terms, an oath was always taken in God's name. It's a pasuk in Dvarim Perek Vav, "Et Hashem Elokecha Tirah," fear God, otot tavod, serve God, uvishmot tishavea. Oaths were not just a contractual civil issue. Oaths were a religious doctrine. You took an oath with God's name. Not only that, in many cases, the Gemara talks about Nikitat Chayfetz. You took a Sefer Torah, you held it in your hands, you took a scroll. There was a notion of an oath taken with an object in your hand that has Kedusha. And that's a mitzvah. If we have to prove something, if we come to a Bezdin and we need to prove something, we need to take testimony. Right, that's still today the case. You walk into a court, you swear, you put your hand on a Bible and you swear, right, that you're going to tell the truth. That's sort of a practice that has been continued in various cultures throughout history. It starts here. That's considered an act of respect to God. But if you violate that oath, and not only have you violated an oath which is in itself a violation, but you have violated an oath in God's name, and now you have publicly created a desecration of God's name, Chilul Hashem. And that has a whole energy into itself. So the notion of the honor and respect to an oath, even if it's on false pretense, but because you took the oath on God's name, if you violate it, it looks bad, so to speak, in a much bigger sense, right, in the name of God, and now you have a Chilul Hashem. There's all kinds of examples of this throughout Tanakh. One of the most famous is, of course, the oath taken by Tzidkiyahu to the king, an oath of loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar at the end of Tanakh, Divrei Yamim Bet, or in the end of Malachim. And the pasuk says that Tzidkiyahu, when he came to his throne, he was put on the throne. He was a vassal king. He was a puppet king of Tzidkiyahu, of Nebuchadnezzar. He takes an oath. V'gam b'melech Nebuchadnezzar marad asher hishbi'o be'elokim. When Tzidkiyahu rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar in violation of an oath he had taken in the name of God. And therefore, in the Chezkel and the Neviim, they go to town. Yirmiyahu is very critical of him for doing so, because the moment you take an oath of loyalty, an oath of a brit, and you do so in the name of God, be very careful about that, because not only does it reflect on you, it now reflects on God, in whose name you took that oath. So they actually both, I think, these explanations are correct. It's a public oath. It reflects on the Jewish people, on their loyalty, and on their bond, their word. But it also is, because the oath was taken in God's name, is an element of a Chilul Hashem, and that's the emphasis in the text. Nishba'u lahem be'elokei Hashem Elokei Yisrael. Anachnu nishba'nu lahem be'Hashem Elokei Yisrael. So as much as they may have wanted to, they felt that they couldn't violate that oath. Now they had to find a solution, and of course the solution was to give them a role that initially, the Neviim, as we said last week, the Neviim's suggestion was to make them some sort of service class to the people, and that's what they suggest here. But Yehoshua is uncomfortable with that suggestion, and so he modifies it to the suggestion of being a service class to the Mishkan. At least it elevates it in status and in category. Chotvei etzim v'shoav emayim lemizbach Hashem ad hayom hazeh. Okay, that's where we left off last week. I just wanted to fill in this piece about Kiddush Hashem, about Chilul Hashem in the oath factor of the Neviim towards the Givonim. Any questions on this first part before we move into the next piece of the story? Next piece of the story is going to take us into a much bigger world. And it's important to do this from time to time, is to sort of take a step back from the Sefer we're learning, especially in the world of Tanakh. It's very important, and recognize that there are these stories have implications for other stories and other events down the road. And in the case of the Givonim, the question becomes who and what role do the Givonim play and what happens to them in the course of history. That's very important for us. We're not going to hear a lot about them in Sefer Yehoshua or in Sefer more in Sefer Yehoshua or in Sefer Shoftim. Well, actually, Yehoshua we will, but in Sefer Shoftim less so. But however, when it comes to Sefer Shmuel, suddenly the story of the Givonim takes on a whole new element. So what I wanted to do today, time permitting, is explore what happens to the Givonim in Sefer Shmuel in the time of Shaul HaMelech and David HaMelech. Where do the Givonim end up? And so that's where we're going to explore. I'm going to actually start from the back of the story, the very end, and then we're going to work our way backwards. Everybody with me? All right. So for those of you who may have been in my series on Sefer Shmuel, some of this may be a review for you, but that's fine. Review is always good. I want to jump to the very end of Shmuel Bet. The very end of Shmuel Bet, there's 4 chapters that seem to be out of place chronologically. If you've studied Sefer Shmuel Bet in particular, you'll have encountered this problem. The last 4 chapters of Sefer Shmuel are a kind of a postscript to the book. They throw on a bunch of elements and stories and texts that are really scattered from all different periods of time in David's life. Why they're at the end of the book, why they're a postscript, what evidence do we have to that effect? That's already several shiurim unto themselves. I'm going to, for now, take that as face value. If you want, we can look at that. Bezrat Hashem, one day we'll study Sefer Shmuel together. If not, you're welcome to go to the recordings and listen. But there is this reference there in the beginning of Perach Chaf Aleph. Vahi ra'av b'mei David shalosh shanim shana achrei shana. Some kind of famine that lasted 3 years in the days of David. Vayivakesh David epnei Hashem. David sought God's explanation. What was this about? Vayomer Hashem, and God answered, El Shaul ve'el Beit Hadamim al asher himit et hagivonim. It's retribution for Shaul and for that blood on his house because he killed all the Givonim, or he put to death the Givonim. And suddenly we're struck by this jarring moment when here we have a brit of the Givonim, and Yehoshua goes out of his way in the Neviim, and they talk about the fact that you can't violate this oath, and we're going to give them a task, we're going to give them a role, because we took an oath. And suddenly, let's say, more or less 400 years later, we come to this text that tells us that Shaul killed all the Givonim. And because of that, there's a famine for 3 years in the land as a retribution. Now, why it's in the days of David is a whole different issue. It has to do with this fact. It's 2 issues here. There's Shaul, and this is already long after the death of Shaul. Gilad, and David has to owes Shaul the debt of proper burial. That's part of the story. But here, part of the story is Beit Damim ala shehimit et ha-givonim. Veikra melech legivonim veyomer alehem. I got a warning that my internet's a little bit fuzzy. Does everybody still hear me and see me clearly? We're good? Okay. Vayikra melech legivonim. The story also has a David HaMelech tragedy to it, which is not our subject for today. David calls the Givonim and he says to them, and now we have a parenthetical comment. The Givonim were not Israelites. They may have been serving in the temple, but in the Mishkan, but they were not Israelites. They were Amorites. Uvnei Yisrael nishba'u lahem, and Israel had taken an oath to them. reference directly to our story. ויבקש שאול להכותם בקנאתו לבני ישראל ויהודה. But Shaul sought to kill them in his zeal for Israel and for Judah. That's the second reference to Shaul's actions against the Givonim. What can I do, says David, to appease you, Givonim, for what Shaul did to you? These are the remnants of the Givonim that are left. ויאמר לו, הגבעונים, אין לנו כסף וזהב עם שאול בן ביתו, ואין לנו איש להמית בישראל. We don't want gold, we don't want silver, we don't want to be paid. We are nothing other than ויאמרו על המלך, האיש אשר קילנו, אשר דימה לנו, נשמדוד מתייצב מחוגבו ישראל. The man that destroyed us, consumed us, devised against us, meaning Shaul, and destroyed the remnant of us. We want 7 of his sons, 7 of his children, and they will be our vengeance against the house of Shaul. That part of the story I'm not going to address today because it's extraordinarily complex and tragic, and David has no choice but to acquiesce. Why he does so, that's the David side of the story. I'm much more interested in the Shaul side of the story, which is, why does Shaul kill the Givonim or massacre the Givonim? What evidence do we have to that? The other piece of the story is the mystery of the fact that this episode of Shaul going to war against the Givonim in violation of the oath explicitly does not appear anywhere in the rest of Tanakh. In other words, there's no reference outside of these 2 psukim. There's no reference to this story. We don't find anywhere where Shaul fights against the Givonim. And yet here at the end of the text of Sefer Shmuel, again, it's not the end of his life, but it's certainly David is now on the throne, Shaul has died. There is certainly this notion, this reference that Shaul had gone to war against the Givonim.
Would it be as part of Nov?
Oh, so that's what the Gemara says. We're going to get to that in a second. So first of all, let's just deal with one piece of information, which is that there is the question: can there be references to events in Tanakh that don't appear in Tanakh? So that that's always the question. In Chumash, you have this in several places. There's a famous the commentary of Rabbi Shulman Kaspi, who says, "Ein safek shezayah emet." There's no question that this event took place. Achashu katuv kan. It's written here that this took place. However, it doesn't have to tell us in the text that this happened. We just have an after-the-fact reference to the fact that it happened. And this is not uncommon in Torah and in Neviim. So the first thing Ibn Kaspi suggests is that if we want to look for reference to this story elsewhere in Tanakh, we may not find it, and that's okay. We have it here, and that's the end of the story, and it's tragic, and Shaul violates this oath that Bnei Israel took, and he goes to war against the Givonim, seemingly for no other reason other than the fact that he, in his zeal for Bnei Israel, right? That's what the pasuk says. Vayivakeshu lahakotam bekanoto livnei Israel v'Yehuda. On the other hand, if you recall, the Gemara does try to address the question of where this took place, and there are several Mefarshim that follow in this path. The question is, why? If you remember, what did they do with the Givonim? Where did they put the Givonim? In the context of the service of the Mishkan. The Mishkan, prior to the building of the Mikdash, the Mishkan was originally in Shiloh, right? Mishkan was placed, first time when Bnei Israel first came into Israel, it was put in Gilgal. It was in Gilgal for a number of years, but Yehoshua, already in the end of Sefer, Yehoshua moves the Mishkan to Gilgal. Sorry, to Shiloh. It stays in Shiloh for something like 370 years, 369 years. So it's in Shiloh for a very long time. It is destroyed in Shiloh. At the very beginning of Sefer Shmuel, there is a battle. The Plishtim come to Shiloh and they destroy Shiloh, and they capture the Aron. And although it doesn't say that the Mishkan was destroyed, in Tehillim it does, and the assumption is that that is when the Mishkan itself is burnt, destroyed. And from that point forward, the Mizbeach is in one location and the Aron is in another. Let me just clarify that. From the fall of Shiloh in the Mishkan, in the rest of Sefer Shmuel, the Mizbeach, the altar, and the Aron, the ark, are never together. So when we say from this point forward, after the fall of Shiloh, that the Mishkan moved here and the Mishkan moved there, we're talking about the Mizbeach, which is what the Chot ve'etzim v'shovei mayim were designed to be, was a service class to the Mizbeach, u'lemizbach Hashem. So they would go wherever the Mizbeach was. In the aftermath of the fall of Shiloh, where did they move the Mishkan? Where did they move the Mizbeach? And the answer is they moved it to a city called Nov. How do I know it's a Nov? Because that's in Sefer Shmuel. We see the Mizbeach is a Nov. And at some point in the story of David and Melech and David and Shaul's conflict, David, and here I'll show you the text. Let's just do a quick review of this story so we have it. After David runs, as David begins to run from the palace and realizing that both Yonatan and David realize that Shaul is going to have him killed, in chapter 21 of Shmuel Aleph, David runs. He spent 3 days hiding in the fields. If you remember the Haftarah of Machar Chodesh, there were 3 days in the field. 2 days in the field. Shaul Yonatan was testing his father's loyalty, and then he comes to him in the field, and he's with the arrows and the whole story. That's the Haftarah of Machar Chodesh, previous chapter. In chapter 21, Vayavod David Nov. He comes to Nov, David. El Achimelech HaKohen, to Achimelech. He's the Kohen Gadol. And he's hungry, and he's tired, and he doesn't have a weapon to defend himself with, etc. And the Kohanim of Nov, they take pity on him. They give him bread, the famous story of him eating of the lechem upon him, and they give him a sword. He has no weapon to defend himself, so they give him the sword of Goliath. And there, Sham Ish me'avdei Shaul bayamun ne'etzah lifnei Hashem u'shmo doeg ha'edomi. Happened to be a loyalist to Shaul who was there. His name was Doeg Adomi. He was a spy, essentially, and he sees what was going on, and he sees that Achimelech gives to David, not only does he give him food, but he also gives him Cherev Goyata Giti, Cherev Goyata Plishti. Next chapter, David goes to hide, and Shaul hears that David had been hiding, and Shaul hears and he says to his servants, "Well, there's nobody here loyal to me. They're all loyal to David. You think David is going to be better to you than I am?" So there comes along the Ego Adomi, who was there, and he says, "Ra'iti et ben Yishai bad Novel Achimelech melech Chituv." I saw David. I saw him in Nov. And I saw him eat bread, and I saw him to have a sword, and the Kohanim of Nov are loyal to David. So he calls Achimelech, and he says to him, "Is this true?" And he kills him for it, and he turns to Doeg Adomi, and he says, "Go and ufgaba Kohanim, go and kill all of the priests." So Doeg Adomi vayifgau b'Kohanim, he goes and he kills all the priests of Nov, vayamot b'yamu shmona v'chamisha ish noseh ephod bad. He kills 85 Kohanim. That Nov ir HaKohanim mikal lefi cherev, and he destroys the city of Nov, razes it to the ground. Me'ish v'yadisha me'olel v'ad yonek v'shor v'chamor v'seh lefi cherev. There's a lot to unpack here, but which we're not a subject, but you can already see the analogy to Amalek. Where Shaul failed at Amalek, he took the mandate against Amalek and he applied it to the people of Nov. Right, the city of the Kohanim. Each man, woman, child, mother, shor chamor, and he destroys everything. It's a couple of people who escape, Achimelech and Aviatar, etc. Okay. Into this story, the question is, this is probably the worst stain on David's career, if you will, up until this point. Much more significant in many ways than even his failure with Amalek. And Chazal talk about
Shaul, not David.
Shaul. Sorry, my shiurim on Shmuel. I always give people a warning that I get names, by slip of tongue, I get names confused. So Shaul, Shmuel, David, yes, Shaul's stain. So here comes. So this is where Chazal placed the story of the Givonim for several reasons. Because if they were a service class to the Mizbeach, when Shaul killed all of the Kohanim and all of the people of Nov, it stands to reason that the Givonim, who should have been there serving in the context of the Mizbeach, would have been impacted at that moment as well. And that's precisely what the Gemara says. Rashi quotes both opinions. The first opinion is the Yerushalmi, which is that when David called over the Givonim and he said to them, "What is this? What do you have against Shaul?" And he says, "Al asher himit mimenu shiva anashim." Drawing on the fact that they asked for 7 of Shaul's sons, the Yerushalmi says that Shaul killed 7 Givonim. 2 chotvei etzim, 2 people who were water drawers, 2 woodcutters, 2 shoavei mayim, 2 of the water drawers, v'chazan, v'sofer, v'shemash, scribe, etc. And so he asks for 7 people. Why there's only 7 of all the Givonim, and after all of that story? So Rabbeinu Amu, says Rashi, that there's a much bigger issue here. מתוך שהרג את הכהנים שהיו מספיקים להם מזון העלה עליו הכתוב כאילו הם איתם. So the Rabbi says they didn't actually kill the Givonim. And here you see the Gemara in Yavamas, but rather he killed the Kohanim. But the Givonim's source of Parnasa, their source of sustenance, was from their work in the Mishkan. If you destroyed the Mishkan, essentially what Shaul does is not just kill the Kohanim, he also destroyed the city of Nov, which means that he destroyed the Mishkan. What the Plishtim did in Shiloh, Shaul does to Nov. And at that point, the Gemara seems to imply that they lost their source of Parnasa, and so they, quote unquote, suffered from it. But the Babli's position seems to be, and this is how Rashi quotes it, that they suffered from the destruction of the Mishkan and Nov. They weren't killed by Shaul, but it's as if he killed them. Yerushalmi says he killed them, but he only killed 7. On the other hand, the Mefarshim say, no, the text says he killed the Givonim. And that's exactly what it means. Says the Radak, Yesh li Shaul ana harag Shaul at the Givonim. Where did Shaul kill the Givonim? V'nashiv ki ba'kotod Nov ir haKohanim hayu shama Givonim imem. When he killed the city of Nov, he destroyed everybody, the Kohanim and the residents of the city. There were Givonim amongst them serving in the Mizbeach. Chotvei etzim v'shoavei mayim v'hargum haKohanim. And he killed them together with the Kohanim. The Medrash Rabbah also takes such an approach. Mahayakina, what was Shaul's zealotry? What was his kino? Why the text says that he killed the Givonim because he was Bikanoto lifnei Yisrael v'Yehuda, in his zeal. So kina can be 2 things. Zeal can be in defense of Israel and Judah, but zeal can also be jealousy, right? We know that kina has 2 meanings. And so the Gemara suggests, Maya kina, why was his zeal, what was the driving Shaul's zeal to destroy the Kohanim, and to destroy the Givonim? Shelo hayu megalim lo hechan David mitchabeh. Because the Givonim, he says, were loyal to David. Just like the Kohanim were loyal to David and the people of Nov were loyal to David. Givonim must have been loyal to David too. So Shaul went in and killed everybody. That's the kina. It's a negative kina, says the Medrash. And that's certainly one approach to the story, that his entire, that the zeal and the zealotry of Shaul was directed at Nov for having harbored David, and the Kohanim for having hidden David and providing him sustenance and food and weapon, and to the Givonim as well, because they sided with the Kohanim and they would have sided with David. Just to work through the Mefarshim for a moment, the Malbim takes a similar approach, but he adds one more piece, because at the end of the day, I still have this textual mystery. On the one hand, the pasuk says, sorry, wrong text. The pasuk says that he killed the Givonim, and then there's a second text that says that Vayivakeshu lakotam b'kanoto libnei Yisrael, in his zeal for the Kohanim. For Bnei Yisrael and for Yehuda. What does the zeal for Bnei Yisrael and Yehuda have to do with Nov? So here the Malbim adds a nuance, very interesting nuance. He says, V'ani omer, ki acharei nergu ha-givonim asher nimtzu az bi'ir Nov. First, he killed all the Givonim that were in the city of Nov, because that's what his focus was, on the fact that they harbored David. She'al zeh amar asher hemit et ha-givonim. Shefach Shaul ke'esh chamato gam al yeter hagivonim hanimtzim ba'arei Yisrael. At that point, Shaul's wrath is kindled against the Givonim, and b'kinato livnei Yisrael v'Yehuda, in his zeal, with zealotry, he goes and he kills attacks the rest of the Givonim that are in all the other cities of Israel. In other words, there are two texts of his crime against the Givonim. Says the Malbim, he did both. He killed the Givonim in Nov, and then he went and he took his wrath further outside of the context of the city of Nov. That's one approach to the story. It appears in the Gemara, in Babli, in Yerushalmi, it appears in the Midrashim, it appears in the Vetak and the Malbim, that somehow this story is connected to Nov. There's another approach in the Mefarshim, just to be aware of it. Oh, actually, I didn't actually, one additional piece of the story, which is what evidence do we have that's any connection between the story of Nov and the attack on Nov and the attack on the Givonim? So I haven't seen this anywhere in the Mefarshim. I did see it in the Sefer, contemporary Sefer. Very interesting suggestion. Where does the Mishkan, where does the Mizbeach go after Shaul destroys Nov? So we have a sequence. It goes from Gilgal to Shiloh, Shiloh to Nov. Mizbeach goes from Nov to, anybody remember? Here's the pasuk in Divrei Yomim. V'tzadok hakohen ve'achav hakohanim lifnei Mishkan Hashem babama asher begiv'on. Mishkan goes from Nov to Giv'on. So again, this is a little more conjecture, but once he destroys Nov, he then moves it's a kind of like adding insult to injury. We're going to take the Mizbeach, which was in Nov, and he's going to move it to the city of Givon. Why? Because he's just destroyed the city of Givon, or he's killed all the Givonim. So now we can move it to the city of Givon. That's a kind of adds insult to injury. That's a theory. I put it out there. I have another theory as to how it ends up in Givon. I'll share that with you in a moment, but you should be aware of that. This is a second approach in the Mefarshim. It appears in the Ralbag, it appears in the Marikara, which is that no connection to Nov at all. There's no reference, there's no text, there's nowhere it says that when he killed the Kohanim of Nov, or he killed the people of Nov, that he in some way engaged with the Givonim. It's not there. The only thing it says is that he killed the Givonim b'kinato livnei Yisrael v'Yehuda, in his zeal for Israel and Judah. So what does that mean? So these Mefarshim suggest that it has nothing to do with Nov, but it is a much bigger picture. Why did Shaul kill the Givonim? She'agivonim lo mibnei Yisrael hema. Text says, right? We read the text of the Givonim are not Israelites. They were from Yeter HaEmori. They were Amorites. Uvnei Yisrael nishbu lehem. We took an oath to protect them. Vayivakesh Shaul hakotam bekinato Linkom nikmat b'nei Yisrael min ha'amim. As Shaul fought against the nations around them, Shaul also wanted to clean the land of any non-Israelites in the land. As he reigned over Israel and Judah, he didn't want to accept the shavua that the Nesiah Ha'idah had made, and the days of Yehoshua. And so he decided to go to war against them. In other words, there isn't a particular trigger to Shaul's attack on the Givonim, but rather this was a retribution for the mekachtos, for the lie that they had perpetrated against Israel. For 400 years they served in the temple, but under false pretense. So Shaul, in his zeal as the king of Israel, decides, you know what, we're going to put a stop to it. And ultimately, he's held somewhat accountable for that as well. That's the second approach. So again, two approaches. The first one sees this as an act of zealotry on Shaul's behalf, independent of anything related to the story of David, and the other sees this very much as part of the retribution to the story of David for having harbored David in the context of the city of Nov being the city of the Mizbeach, and the Mizbeach therefore being the centerpiece around which the story revolves. Two options, both perfectly possible, plausible. I'll offer you a third possibility, and this is not in the Mefarshim, but I did hear this from Rav Medan once. Very interesting theory, which is, if I want to pinpoint when, how, and where there would have been an excuse for Shaul to go to war against the Givonim, a possibility. For this, we need to roll the clock back even further. And roll the clock back to the story of the Battle of Michmas. What's the Battle of Michmas? Battle of Michmas is the first major battle Shaul fights when he first comes to power. In Sefer Shmuel, Shaul is anointed in chapter 10. There's an initial battle against a city on the east side of the Jordan called, or in defense of the city on the east side of the Jordan called Yavesh Gilad, against Ammon. Shaul fights that battle, and then he's re-anointed, and then he has to be anointed again. There's a whole story. I'm not going to get into it. Chapters 9, 10, 11, 12. And then we get to the first real made test of Shaul's leadership as king. It's called the Battle of Michmas. And Shaul has 3,000 soldiers together. Shaul has 3,000 soldiers. His son Yonatan is captain over 1,000 soldiers, and they are engaged in the defense against the Plishtim, in a war against the Plishtim in an area called Michmas. There's a outpost of the Plishtim there that Yonatan has to take out, and that's not our subject for now. Beginning of chapter 14, Yonatan Nabra el Matzava Plishtim. Yonatan says, let's go over and attack this garrison of Plishtim. And it's a major campaign, and in the end, they are able to be successful. Okay, that's the first major campaign of Shaul. Where is Michmas? Simple question. Where is Michmas? So here's a map. Let's see if I can find this here's a better look at the map. Okay, can everybody see this map? This is essentially a map of the area. It's a little fuzzy, but you can see it. Here is Yevus, Yerushalayim, Bethlehem. Yevus hasn't been conquered. Here's Yericho. Here's Gilgal. More or less, you can see where things are. Shaul is in Givat Shaul, or Geva Asher Binyamin. Geva is the capital city of Binyamin. And so that's where Shaul is, in Givat Shaul, that's where Shaul is king. That's where his capital is. In Shevet Binyamin, just north of Geva Binyamin, before you get to Beit El, is the city of Michmash. Michmas, depending on the map. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Now, the story is a tragic story because Shaul starts with such a major anticipation. His first major battle against the city of Gilad, which is out here. And by the time we get to Michmas, however, he's a small army and a small force, and there's a challenge. It's a challenging moment for Shaul. But he's victorious. And in the end, with Yonatan's help, famous about 2 chapters, you're welcome to read it. What's my question? Simple question. It's against the Plishtim. The Plishtim are here, city of Gat. How do the Plishtim get from Gat to Michmas? This is purple is all Israelite. How do here's Beit Shemesh, Hebron. How do the Plishtim get from Gat to Michmas? Unless they have the same question I asked a couple of weeks ago. How do the Israelites get from Gilgal to Shechem? Remember that question? How did the Israelites get from Gilgal to Shechem without a battle? They must have had allies in the area which were loyal to Yehoshua. Okay? If the Plishtim are coming to Michmas and they're coming through Emek Ayalon, they must have had allies, assistance. Otherwise, how do they get there without a skirmish? What city lies right in the middle of their path? Givon.
Givon.
So Medan's theory is that the only way the Plishtim could have come to Michmas was if the Givonim had given them safe passage. And if that's true, then after the battle is over and Shaul was successful against the Plishtim, it would have been the perfect opportunity for him to turn against the Givonim and say, okay, you helped our allies, enemy of my enemy. And this is a friend of my enemy. You are an ally. You are going to now feel the wrath of Shaul, Bekinato, Livnei Israel v'Yehuda. So that's another possibility. Again, there is no evidence to this explicitly other than looking at a map and realizing that Givon stands right in the middle, and it stands to reason that Shaul would have considered them, whether truly or not. But it stands to reason that Shaul might have considered them now an enemy force because of their loyalty to God, loyalty to the Plishtim, and Bnei Israel, they're not from Bnei Israel, they're Amorites. Okay. Adkan, that's another possibility. That's the end of the story of the Givonim. But it's not really the end. Because after Shaul's death, there's one other additional piece of the story that we have to take into consideration. So let's fast forward. Shaul dies at the end of Shmuel Aleph. David sets himself up initially he was anointed as king to take over in the area of Shevet Yehuda, not of all of Israel, just of Shevet Yehuda, because in the rest of Israel, who is designated as the king after Shaul's death?
Ishboshet.
Ishboshet. Shmuel Bet Perak Bet. People of Judah anoint David as king, and Avner ben Ner, who was the general for Shaul, he goes and he takes Ishboshet ben Shaul, who was the one surviving son of Shaul in the Battle of Har Geba, and he takes him over to Machanaim, and there he makes him king, he anoints him, and his kingdom spreads, and over all of Israel, up to and including Binyamin, and so now I have a split kingdom. I have essentially the kingdom of Shaul, which is orange, and the kingdom of David, which is blue or gray. And that starts a civil war. That starts a civil war between the forces of David and the forces of Ishboshet, led by Avner ben Ner. Anybody know where the civil war starts? Avner ben Ner v'avdei Ishboshet b'shol mimachanaim Giv'ona, v'Yoav ben Tzuya v'avdei David yatzu v'yifkeshu b'birchat Giv'on. The forces of Avner and the forces of David meet at the brecha of Giv'on, the springs of Giv'on. So this city of Giv'on plays an extraordinary role in this whole story. It's right there, center between Judah and Binyamin. And in the end, that starts a civil war between the two forces that lasts quite some time. It's a major campaign. And in the end, just go back, long war. It's a long war, certainly in biblical terms. And we come to Perek Dalet. After the death of Avner ben Ner, which the story on itself, Vayishma ben Shaul, Kimet Avner b'Chevron, Shaul, son Ishboshet, hears that Avner was killed in Hebron, was killed by Yoav. Vayirpu yadav, he was very weak. V'yichoyso nifalu, and his soul is dismayed. Ushnei anashim sarei gdudim hayu. There were two captains in the army. Hayu ben Shaul, in the army of the son of Shaul, had two captains. Shem echad Ba'ana, first one, his name was Ba'ana. V'shem hasheni Rechav, and the second was Rechav. Ba'ana and Rechav, captains in Ishboshet's army, Bnei Rimon haBe'eroti, sons of Rimon from Be'erot. Mibnei Binyamin, of the children of the Mibnei Binyamin. Mibnei Binyamin can mean several things. It can mean they were from the tribe of Binyamin, or it can mean they were from a city that was attributed to the tribe of Binyamin. Ki gam Be'erot techasheva Binyamin, because Be'erot is also considered amongst the cities of Binyamin. And in fact, that is the case. Both Givon and Be'erot appear in the list of cities attributed to Shevet Binyamin. That's why I said to you, another theory as to why he moves the Mizbeach from Nov to Givon is because Givon is a city in Shevet Binyamin. It says so explicitly in Shua Perek Yudchet. The cities of the tribe of Binyamin include Givon, Ramah, and Be'erot. Okay, so that makes sense. Let's go back to where we were. So we have a city in Shevet Binyamin called Be'erot and Givon, are both in Binyamin. And we have these two sons of Rimon, brothers, Bana and Rechav. Vayivruchu haBe'erotim gitaima. But the Be'erotites, meaning those who were indigenous to the city of Be'erot, they fled to, you want to parse this word? What does it mean? Vayivruchu gitaima. They fled to Gat.
Gat.
To Gat, city of Gat, Ir Plishtim. Vayusham garim ad hayom hazeh, and that's where they lived until this day. This verse is a mystery. What on earth is this verse doing in this story? Come back to it. Uli Yonatan ben Shaul ben Nachan. There's a second issue here, which is the introduction to Mephibosheth, not our topic for now. Let's go back to Bnei Rimon. Vayechu Bnei Rimon be'eroti rechavu ba'ana. These two sons of Rimon from the city of Be'erot, by the name of Rechav and Ba'ana, they come into the house of Ishboshet in the middle of the day. And he's taking his fiesta, he's taking his nap, his siesta. They came into the middle of the house as if they were coming to fetch wheat. And they stabbed and killed Ishboshet. Why did they kill Ishboshet? Because they figured now the kingdom is fallen. The chief of staff of Avner ben Ner has been killed, and Ishboshet is weak. So now is the time to unite the whole kingdom with David. So these two captains of his army, Rechav and Ba'ana Achiv, they come into to the house of Ishboshet and they kill him. He's king of Israel, king of north of Israel. And they escape. More detail, they come into the house, he's sleeping, they kill him, they slay him. Some of us said they came back a second time to take his head off. Why did they take his head off? A very gross, grotesque
To bring it to
story.
David.
Oh, because they want to bring it to David. They go south all through night. They come to David in Hebron with the head of Ishboshet, who is the king of the northern tribes. Here is the head of Ishboshet ben Shaul, your enemy, who sought your life. May God repay your enemies 100-fold. They thought David was going to promote them, welcome them with open arms. David was so angry that they had the audacity to lay their hands on the king of Israel that he has these two Rechav and Ba'ana killed on the spot. They're constantly introduced in the same fashion. Rechav and Ba'ana, brothers, Bnei Rimon from Be'erot. I don't know, I've introduced them now 4 times in this text. I don't know why they have to constantly be introduced in this way. And he says to them, that's the whole introduction, I'm not going to go through it, but he says, Anashim Rishaim, these are wicked people. Avakeshet damomi etchem, I will seek. How dare you lay your hands on Mashiach Hashem, on the anointed of God? How do you do that? Vayitzav David et hanarim vayahargum, and he has them executed on the spot. Okay. So they miscalculated. They miscalculated David. They miscalculated who David was and what he would see as good or bad. But I'm really curious who these Rechav and Ba'ana are. Bnei Rimon, Habe'eroti, and they're constantly referred to that way. Shem Echad Ba'ana, Shem Sheni Rechav, Bnei Rimon Habe'eroti, and Vayivruchu Habe'erotim Gitaima. Yes, it tells us that the rest of Be'erot ran to Gat, and they lived there. So what, did these two people who lived, they were originally from Be'erot, but now they come from Gat? Captains in Ishboshet's army? Vayalchu Bnei Rimon Habe'eroti, Rechavu Ba'ana. And they come to David. How many times do I have to emphasize that they come from Be'erot and they're Bnei Rimon? Unless what the text is trying to tell me is a little more subtle. Come back to the story of Be'erot, the city of Binyamin. Gigam Be'erot techashev Binyamin. So the text says they were from David's. They were Ishboshet was from Sheva Binyamin. Ben Shaul, Shaul was from Binyamin. Be'erot was from Binyamin. They were Binyaminites. They were from the same tribe as Shaul. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe the text is telling me Vayivruchu Be'erotim Gitaima because there's a story here about the city of Be'erot. What's significant about the city of Be'erot? Come back to Yehoshua Perek Tet. Our story, our parak. When they go and they find the Givonim, what are the names of the cities of the Givonim? Givon, Fira, Be'erot, and Kiryat Ye'arim. So here's the theory. The theory is that these two Bnei Rechav Ubnei Ba'ana and Rechav, Bnei Rimon. Rimon is also the gods, the deities of one of the king of Aram. Right? Bnei Rimon HaBe'eroti were in fact the Givonim in the city of Be'erot. And it tells us that the city, the inhabitants of Be'erot had run to Gat. Why would the inhabitants of Be'erot have run to Gat? Why would they have had to have fled to Gat? Because in the aftermath of the battle of Michmas, Shaul went and he attacked all the Givonim because of their loyalty to Plishtim. So what did they do? They say, okay, so fine. So they ran to Gat. They needed escape. So they did exactly what David did when Shaul was trying to kill David. He ran to Gat too. And suddenly, this vengeance against the people against the Givonim, maybe after the Battle of Michmas, but this vengeance comes back to haunt him. Because now the descendants of, not descendants, same people, right? The next generation, right? The captains in the army, Ba'ana and Rechav, who are from Beirut, who fled to Gat, but they serve in Ishboshet's army, they take vengeance against Shaul. And when they bring the head of Ishboshet to David, they do so as Givonites who say to David, oh, you see, Shaul was attacked the Givonim. We took a vengeance against Shaul. Here's your enemy. We have the hands of your enemy. David looks at them and he says, you Givonim, you killed Shaul, not because you thought it would be loyal to me, but because of vengeance against Shaul. And he has them killed. And that essentially is the tragedy of the Givonim. From Shaul's vengeance against the Givonim, that story comes back to haunt him in the end, because Ishboshet ben Shaul, who sat on his throne, was ultimately killed by the very descendants of the very Givonim against whom Shaul had attacked and had sent them running to the city of Gat. So this is not a happy story. I hope I said that at the very beginning. Right? This is a tragedy, but it starts with the tragedy of Shaul's vengeance against them, and eventually there is evidence to support the suggestion that Ishboshet ben Shaul is actually killed by Gibonim from the city of Be'erot. Possibility. Radak says they are from Binyamin, but I am more inclined to suggest that they are in fact from Givonim. And that's really the end of the story of the Givonim. We won't hear from them ever again in Tanakh. There is a different group called the Netinim, which Chazal talk about as possibly connected to the Givonim. But in terms of the Givonim themselves, their story ends here. And with that, I will stop and take questions.
Wasn't the Aron HaKodesh in Kiryat Yearim for a long time? Oh.
After Givon, it goes to Kiryat Yearim, and there it stays until David. The Aron is in Kiryat Yearim.
No, the Aron is in Kiryat Yearim. That's why I'm asking. So they didn't recognize them? It means the Jews lived there. So they lived among them. So how come they didn't recognize them when they came and they lied?
You're confusing two stories.
Oh.
Aron is moved to Kiryat Yearim in Sefer Shoftim. Sorry, the Aron is moved to Kiryat Yearim after the fall of the Plishtim. It's the beginning of the fall of the Mishkan, the beginning of Sefer Shmuel.
Nachon.
We are 400 years earlier in Sefer Yehoshua.
Right. Okay, I'm confusing. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But the Aron and the Mizbech are separated. So we were talking about the Mizbech, and that's about the Aron.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I didn't understand. I believe you covered it last time. Why did the Givonim have to use that ploy if it could have said we are going to keep the Shabbat Mitzvot Bnei Noach, and that's it.
Right, so that's a machloket in the Rishonim. Some Rashi, others who suggest that didn't apply to the Canaanites. The Rambam and many say that it did apply to the Canaanites, but it only applied prior to the beginning of the conquest, which is one possibility, one interpretation, or I think is probably closer to Pshat, is that the Givonim simply didn't know that. And so they thought that there was no option other than to pretend that they weren't local Canaanites. And once they had deceived Israel, so then Israel had the right to go and attack them. But the Rambam seems to say that the entire story was unfortunately a case of mistaken identity, literally. They did not need to do that. Okay? All right, we'll stop here next week. B'ezrat Hashem, we start chapter 10.
I have a question still.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Why isn't it considered? Oh, let me try and. Why isn't it considered a chilul Hashem that God is so easily fooled? In other words, why isn't it that this God can sniff out cheaters and liars? Instead, it's if his vanity is so great that when you make a vow in his name, even if it's a lie, that's preferable to the truth. I mean, you could spin it that way.
You can spin almost anything. When they took the oath, it says that Pnei Hashem lo shalu. When they took the oath to make a brit with the Givonim, text says explicitly that they didn't ask God's opinion.
But God still could have intervened in the form of a Navi or something.
In the history of Tanakh and in the history of the world, that doesn't operate that way.
Okay, that's a fair answer. By the way, there's a parallel, there's a similar story about Ishbosheth and David with Pompey Magnus and Julius Caesar, that wants to curry favor with Julius Caesar when Pompey was in Egypt, killed him, brought the head, and they said, how can you dare? So this is a common theme in the Middle East. How do you dare kill one of our people? I can kill him, but you can't kill him. So there is
I think David's reaction
like
is
1,000 years later.
But David's reaction is not that I could kill him. David's reaction is.
But if they were fighting a civil war, it means that his forces could kill him, but not this guy.
Okay, I'll buy that. Interesting. Okay, folks, have a wonderful afternoon or an evening, and we will see you B'ezrat Hashem next week.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
But David tells his people all the time not to kill Shaul. So there's a history of
twice
protecting. Yes.
Twice. Correct. And he has the same reaction to the Amalekites who come to tell him, this is in the text, and that parak actually references it. When the Amalekites come to tell him, Eved Amaleki, that Shaul had died, and he tells him that Shaul died because he asked him to fall on the sword, and right, the whole story, and he has him killed just for sharing the news with him. I mean, I think he knew that they had a role in Shaul's death. So here he says to them, if they were just bringing me the news of Shaul's death, I had them killed. You who actually killed the king, how much more so? So he has them I think he knew exactly what was going on.
Thank you very much.
Okay, have a wonderful day.